The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside the general store in St. Joseph, Missouri, throwing Valentina Jankovic forward against the worn wooden seat, her heart hammering with equal parts fear and anticipation as she clutched the crumpled letter that had brought her across an ocean and half a continent to marry a man whose face she had never seen. The year was 1882, and everything about this dusty frontier town felt impossibly foreign to the young woman who had grown up in the mountains of Montenegro, where the Adriatic Sea sparkled in the distance and everyone spoke her language. Now, stepping down from the coach on trembling legs, she found herself surrounded by sounds and words that might as well have been birdsong for all the sense they made to her. The driver, a weathered man with tobacco-stained teeth, gestured impatiently for her to collect her belongings. Valentina grabbed her single worn trunk, nearly dropping it as she hauled it down. The weight of it represented everything she owned in this world. Her mother's embroidered linens, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a wooden comb her father had carved before the fever took him, and a small icon of St. Nicholas wrapped carefully in cloth. Around her, people moved with purpose through the muddy Main Street, their boots squelching in the aftermath of yesterday's rain. Wooden buildings lined both sides of the thoroughfare, their false fronts making them appear grander than they were. A saloon's tinny piano music drifted on the autumn breeze, mingling with the smell of horse manure and wood smoke. She stood there, alone and terrified, clutching the letter that bore the name Vincent Keller and an address she could not read. A woman in a fine green dress passed by, giving Valentina's threadbare traveling clothes a dismissive glance before hurrying on. The sun beat down mercilessly despite the season, and Valentina felt sweat trickling down her spine beneath her high-collared blouse. She had no idea how to find the man who was supposed to become her husband, no way to ask for directions, no means of communicating her predicament to anyone. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she stood beside her trunk, trying to look purposeful while panic rose in her throat. What if he did not come? What if he had changed his mind? The marriage broker in New York had assured her that Mr. Keller was a respectable rancher in need of a wife, that he understood she spoke only Montenegrin and a bit of Serbian, that it would not matter. Now, surrounded by the incomprehensible chatter of English, she wondered how anyone could have believed such a thing. A hand touched her shoulder and she jumped, spinning around to face a tall man whose shadow fell across her like a protective canopy. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water after rain, green-brown and surprisingly gentle in a face that was all hard planes and angles. Dark hair curled slightly at his collar beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and dust covered his boots and the lower half of his canvas trousers. He held his hat in his other hand now, having removed it in a gesture she recognized as respectful even if nothing else made sense. "Miss Jankovic," he said, and though she did not understand the words that followed, she understood her name. "Da," she breathed, then remembered the English word the broker had taught her. "Yes, Vincent Keller." Relief broke across his features like sunrise, transforming his serious face into something approaching handsome. He nodded, then reached for her trunk as though it weighed nothing. He spoke again, a longer string of words accompanied by a gesture toward the end of the street. She followed because there was nothing else to do, walking slightly behind him as they made their way past the general store, a millinery shop, a blacksmith whose forge glowed orange in the dim interior, and a land office with official-looking notices posted in the window. At the edge of town, a buckboard wagon waited, hitched to 2 sturdy horses that stamped and tossed their heads. Vincent loaded her trunk into the back with ease, then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hands at her waist were strong but careful, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at this first touch from the man who was meant to be her husband. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking his tongue at the horses in a way that needed no translation. They rolled out of St. Joseph heading west, and Valentina watched the town fall away behind them. The land here was different from her mountainous homeland, vast and rolling with endless sky pressing down from above. Tall grass rippled in waves like a golden ocean, and scattered trees marked the lines of distant creeks. The air smelled of earth and grass, and something wild she could not name. Beside her, Vincent held the reins loosely, occasionally glancing her way with an expression she could not quite read. After perhaps an hour, he cleared his throat and pointed to himself. "Vincent," he said clearly. Then he pointed to her, eyebrows raised in question. "Valentina," she replied and saw him smile. "Valentina," he repeated, and the way he said it, with the emphasis slightly different from how her own people pronounced it, sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. He pointed ahead to where a line of trees marked what must be a river or creek. "Home," he said, then added other words she did not catch. As they drew closer, she saw buildings emerging from the landscape. A house of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, a large barn painted red with white trim, several smaller outbuildings and corrals where horses moved like living sculptures. It was bigger than she had expected, more substantial. The house had glass windows and a covered porch, and someone had planted flowers along the front that still bloomed in shades of gold and rust, despite the late season. Vincent pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake. Before she could move, he had jumped down and come around to her side, reaching up to help her down. Again, those careful hands at her waist, lowering her until her feet touched solid ground. He held on a moment longer than necessary, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, then stepped back and gestured toward the house. The interior was dim and cool after the bright sunshine. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs occupied the center, and shelves lined the walls holding dishes, pots, and supplies. Everything was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived alone and saw no need for decoration. 2 doors led off the main room, one standing open to reveal a bedroom with a large bed covered in a faded quilt. Vincent set her trunk down and seemed suddenly unsure of himself. He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in a way that would have been comical if she had not been equally nervous. He pointed to the bedroom, then to her, then to himself, and she felt her face flame as she understood he was trying to explain sleeping arrangements. He held up his hands as though to calm a skittish horse and pointed to the other door, speaking words that sounded reassuring even though she could not understand them. He opened that door to reveal a smaller room with a narrow bed and not much else. "You," he said, pointing to the larger bedroom. "Me," pointing to the smaller room. He repeated this twice more until she nodded, relief and something that might have been disappointment warring in her chest. The rest of that first day passed in awkward pantomime. He showed her the kitchen, opening cabinets and pointing to their contents: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, dried beans. The pump at the sink that brought water from the well. The door leading to the root cellar, cool and dim and smelling of earth, where potatoes and carrots and apples were stored. Behind the house, a chicken coop where red hens clucked and scratched, and a smokehouse where meat hung in aromatic darkness. She tried to show she understood, nodding and repeating English words after him. Water, coffee, eggs. Her accent was thick, the sounds unfamiliar in her mouth, but he smiled each time she tried. encouraging her with gestures that transcended language. That evening, she cooked dinner using the supplies she found, making a simple stew from salt pork, potatoes, and onions. It was not the food of her homeland, but her mother had taught her to work with what was available. Vincent came in from the barn as the sun set, bringing with him the smell of horses and hay. He washed at the pump outside, then sat at the table, watching her ladle stew into bowls. They ate in silence, the scrape of spoons against pottery the only sound. She was acutely aware of him across the table, of the way his hands moved, scarred and capable, of how he ate with surprising neatness for a man who lived alone on the frontier. Once their eyes met, and he smiled at her, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made her heart do strange things in her chest. After dinner, as darkness pressed against the windows, he stood and gestured to the bedroom. She went, closing the door behind her and leaning against it, breathing hard. She could hear him moving around in the main room, the clink of dishes being washed, the thud of his boots on the wooden floor. Later, she heard the other door close, and then silence. She lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at shadows on the ceiling cast by moonlight through the window. Tomorrow, she would be married to this stranger. A justice of the peace was coming to the ranch. Vincent had managed to convey through gestures and the few words they shared. And then what? How did one build a life, a marriage with someone whose words were nothing but noise? Morning came too quickly. Valentina rose and dressed in her best dress, the one she had saved for the wedding, a dark blue cotton that her mother had helped her sew before the decision was made to come to America. She brushed her long, dark hair and tried to tame it into a proper bun, but curls kept escaping to frame her face. Her hands shook as she pinned it. When she emerged from the bedroom, Vincent was already dressed in what must be his best clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt that looked newly washed, his hair slicked back with water. He stopped moving when he saw her, just stared for a long moment, and something in his expression made her feel beautiful despite her worn dress and nervous hands. "Beautiful," he said softly, and though she did not know the word, she understood the tone, the look in his eyes. The justice of the peace arrived mid-morning, a thin man with spectacles and an impressive mustache, carrying an official-looking book. With him came a neighbor, an older rancher named Tom who would serve as witness. Both men's eyes widened slightly when they realized Valentina spoke no English, but Vincent said something firm and unyielding that made them nod and proceed. The ceremony was brief and incomprehensible to Valentina. The justice read from his book, occasionally glancing at her as though expecting a response she could not give. Vincent had clearly explained the situation beforehand, because the man simplified his words, speaking slowly and clearly, then just asked Vincent to indicate when she should say, "I do." Vincent turned to her and took her hands in his. They were warm and rough with calluses, the hands of a man who worked hard every day. He looked into her eyes and said something in English, then simply, "Yes," she understood. This was her moment to choose, to commit, to say the words that would bind her life to his. She thought of Montenegro, of her mother's grave beside her father's, of her brothers scattered to other countries seeking work, of having nothing and no one left in the old world. She thought of Vincent's gentle eyes and careful hands, of how he had given her the larger bedroom, of his smile when she tried English words. "Yes," she said clearly, "I do." Vincent's face broke into a smile that transformed him. The justice said more words, then pronounced them married. Vincent leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a breath. Her first kiss. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment the world narrowed to just that soft pressure. The smell of soap and sun warmed cotton, the whisper of his breath against her skin. The neighbor Tom clapped Vincent on the shoulder and said something congratulatory. The justice had them sign the marriage certificate, guiding Valentina's hand to the right line. She signed her name in the Cyrillic script she had learned as a child, the letters looking foreign and exotic among the English words surrounding them. After the men left, Vincent and Valentina stood in the main room of the house, suddenly alone as husband and wife. The silence stretched between them, not quite uncomfortable but weighted with everything they could not say. Finally, Vincent gestured to the door, then made a walking motion with his fingers. "Show you," he said, adding words she did not know but guessing he meant to show her the ranch. They walked out into the crisp autumn morning, and he led her first to the barn. Inside, the smell of hay and horses enveloped them. He showed her each stall, introducing the horses by name as though they were people. A gray mare named Silver who nuzzled Valentina's hand looking for treats. A bay gelding named Rusty who stamped impatiently until Vincent gave him a piece of apple from his pocket. A black stallion named Midnight who watched them with intelligent eyes from the largest stall. Vincent pointed to Silver, then to Valentina, repeating this several times. She understood he was giving her the mare, assigning the horse to her. She stroked Silver's soft nose, murmuring Montenegrin endearments, and the horse whickered softly in response. Vincent watched with approval. They visited the other buildings, the tack room smelling of leather and oil, the chicken coop where Valentina gathered eggs while the hens complained, the smokehouse, the workshop where tools hung in neat rows on the walls. Beyond the immediate buildings, pastures stretched into the distance, filled with cattle bearing Vincent's brand. He was not a poor man, she realized. This was a substantial operation, probably requiring hired help during busy seasons. As they walked, Vincent talked, a steady stream of English words. She understood none of it but found herself listening to the rhythm of his voice, the rise and fall of his sentences, the occasional laugh when something amused him. He had a good voice, deep and steady, and she found it comforting even without comprehension. They stopped at a small cemetery plot on a hill overlooking the ranch, marked by a simple wooden fence. 2 graves lay within, their markers weathered but readable. Vincent's voice changed, became softer, sadder. He pointed to the markers, said names. Sarah Keller, James Keller. Then he pointed to himself. Mother, father, Valentina understood loss. She knelt and touched the earth over the graves, then made the sign of the cross in the Orthodox manner, right to left. When she looked up, Vincent was watching her with an expression of such gratitude that tears pricked her eyes. He helped her to her feet, and for a moment they stood there, hands clasped. 2 people who had both known grief even if they could not share the stories. That night, Valentina cooked again, experimenting with the unfamiliar ingredients. She made cornbread from the cornmeal she found, though it came out different from the bread she knew. Vincent ate 2 pieces and nodded enthusiastically, saying words that sounded approving. She found herself wanting to please him, to see that smile again. After dinner, he pulled out a worn book and opened it on the table. It had pictures alongside the English words, a children's primer, she realized, for teaching reading. He pointed to a picture of a cat, then to the word beneath, cat. He repeated it, waiting. Cat, she tried, and the word felt strange. He smiled and nodded, then pointed to the next picture. Dog, dog. They went through page after page, Vincent patient as she stumbled over the foreign sounds. Horse, cow, chicken, house, tree, sun, moon. Some words were easier than others, and she found herself laughing when she got one particularly wrong, the tension of the day finally breaking. Vincent laughed too, and the sound filled the house with warmth. When her eyes grew heavy, he closed the book and gestured to the bedroom. She rose, hesitated, then impulsively touched his shoulder. "Thank you," she said in English, words the broker had taught her. His hand came up to cover hers, warm and solid. "You are welcome," he said slowly, and she repeated it after him, adding the phrase to her small collection of English words. The days fell into a rhythm. Vincent rose before dawn and worked the ranch, returning for breakfast, which Valentina learned to make the American way: eggs, bacon, biscuits. He taught her the words for everything, pointing and naming, patient when she forgot and had to ask again through gestures. She, in turn, taught him a few Montenegrin words, laughing at his pronunciation of her native tongue. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he had a sweet tooth and loved when she made apple pie from the fruit in the cellar, that he sang while he worked though his voice was not particularly good. She learned that he was careful with the animals, gentle even with the cattle when they were being stubborn, that he could fix almost anything that broke, that he read in the evenings when work was done, his lips moving slightly with the words. He learned that she was afraid of spiders but would catch and release them outside rather than kill them, that she hummed while she cooked, that she said prayers in her own language every night before bed. He learned that she missed her homeland but did not cry where he could see, that she was stronger than she looked, that she watched him when she thought he was not paying attention. 3 weeks into their marriage, a storm rolled in from the west, turning the sky bruise purple and sending the animals running for shelter. Vincent came pounding into the house just as the first raindrops fell, big as coins, splattering in the dust. Within minutes, the sky opened up completely, rain hammering on the roof like fists, wind howling around the corners of the house. Lightning cracked so close the hair on Valentina's arms stood up, and the thunder that followed shook the dishes on the shelves. She had never been afraid of storms in Montenegro, but this was different, more violent, more visceral. When the next lightning bolt illuminated the room in stark white brilliance, she gasped and stumbled backward. Vincent was there immediately, his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She could feel his heart beating steady and strong, could feel the rise and fall of his breathing. He said something into her hair, words she did not understand, but the meaning was clear. "You are safe, I am here. Nothing will harm you." She turned her face into his shoulder and let herself be held. This man who was still mostly a stranger but who felt in this moment like the only solid thing in a chaotic world. His hand stroked her hair, gentle, soothing, and she felt the tension drain from her body. They stood like that for long minutes while the storm raged outside, and something shifted between them, some barrier dissolving like salt in water. When the worst of the storm passed, moving east with rumbling complaints, Vincent loosened his hold and stepped back slightly. He looked down at her, rain damp and wind blown in his arms, and lifted one hand to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed across her skin, a question in the gesture, and she leaned into his touch in answer. He kissed her then, not the brief ceremonial kiss of their wedding, but something deeper, more real. Her hands came up to grip his shirt, holding on as the world tilted and reformed around this new truth. She wanted him, this quiet rancher who spoke words she could not understand but whose actions showed her kindness every day. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "Valentina," he whispered, and her name in his mouth was a prayer, a promise, a question all at once. "Vincent," she replied, and in their two names was a conversation without words, an understanding that passed between them like lightning without the thunder. That night, he did not go to the small bedroom. That night, she took his hand and led him to the larger room, to the bed they would finally share as husband and wife. Their coming together was tender and uncertain. Two people learning each other's bodies the way they had been learning each other's languages, with patience and care and a growing sense of wonder. Afterward, she lay with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow back to normal, feeling his fingers trace lazy patterns on her shoulder. He said something soft in English, and though she did not know the words, she understood he was telling her she was beautiful, special, treasured. She replied in Montenegrin, telling him he was good and kind, and that she was beginning to care for him more than she had thought possible. Neither understood the other's words, but both understood the meaning, and that was enough. As winter approached, Valentina learned more English, her vocabulary expanding from simple nouns to basic phrases. I am cooking dinner. The chickens need water. Your shirt has a hole. Each sentence was a small victory, and Vincent celebrated them all, his pride in her progress evident even without words. She also learned the work of the ranch. Vincent taught her to ride Silver, first just walking around the corral, then trotting, finally cantering across the open pastures with the wind in her hair and Vincent riding beside her on midnight. She learned to help with feeding the animals, to check the fence lines for damage, to recognize when a cow was about to calve. Her hands, which had been soft in Montenegro, developed calluses. Her skin, which had been pale, turned golden from the sun. Vincent seemed to delight in her competence, in how she threw herself into learning this new life. When she successfully repaired a section of fence by herself, he picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing. When she made her first successful batch of biscuits that actually rose instead of sitting like heavy rocks in the pan, he ate 4 of them and declared them the best he had ever tasted. And she did not need perfect English to know he was exaggerating, but loved him a little more for it anyway. The first snow came in late November, transforming the landscape overnight into something from a fairy tale. Valentina stood on the porch, wrapped in one of Vincent's coats because she had not brought anything warm enough for a Missouri winter, and stared in wonder. Vincent came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Beautiful," she said in English. "Yes," he agreed, but when she glanced back, he was looking at her, not the snow. They spent that winter in a cocoon of domesticity, the work of the ranch reduced by the weather. Vincent took care of the essential tasks while Valentina learned to bake bread, to churn butter, to sew with the fabric he brought back from a trip to town. The evenings were long and dark, and they spent them by the fire, Vincent reading aloud in English while Valentina followed along in the primer, stopping him when she did not understand a word. Her English improved rapidly with his patient teaching and her own determination. By Christmas, she could hold basic conversations, though she still struggled with complex ideas and often had to resort to gestures or Montenegrin when she became frustrated. Vincent gave her a gift for Christmas, a beautiful shawl in deep red, softer than anything she had ever touched. She gave him a shirt she had sewn herself, the stitches careful and even, embroidered at the collar in a traditional Montenegrin pattern. He put it on immediately and wore it every Sunday after, no matter that he had nicer shirts, and she understood what he was telling her, that he valued her heritage, her skills, her effort. On Christmas night, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, Vincent pulled her into his lap in the rocking chair and held her close. "I love you," he said clearly, slowly, making sure she understood each word. Her English was good enough now to respond properly. "I love you too," she said, and kissed him, tasting peppermint from the candy canes he had brought from town. His arms tightened around her, and she felt the truth of it settling into her bones. This was home, This man was hers and she was his, and somehow, without planning or expecting it, she had found happiness in this strange land with this good man. Spring came late and fast, the snow melting seemingly overnight, the world turning green almost while they watched. The ranch work intensified, and Vincent hired 2 hands to help with calving season and fence repair. They were young men, barely 20, named Pete and Charlie, who bunked in the barn and took their meals at the house. At first, Valentina was nervous cooking for strangers, worried her English would fail her or they would mock her accent. But the cowboys were unfailingly polite, complimenting her cooking extravagantly and teaching her Western slang that made Vincent shake his head in mock disapproval. Through them, she learned about the broader community, about the other ranchers in the area, about the social structure of this frontier world. In April, Vincent decided they should have a proper celebration for their marriage, having been too rushed the previous fall. He announced they would host a barn dance, inviting all the neighbors and ranch families from 20 miles around. Valentina panicked at first, worried about hosting such an event with her still imperfect English, but Vincent was adamant. "They will love you," he said firmly, "just as I do." For 2 weeks, they prepared. Vincent and the hired hands cleaned the barn thoroughly, moving equipment and laying down fresh planks for a dance floor. Valentina cooked and baked, filling the root cellar with pies and cakes and biscuits, preparing vast quantities of food for what Vincent promised would be a crowd. The day of the dance, wagons began arriving in the afternoon. Whole families came, children spilling out of wagon beds, women carrying covered dishes, men heading immediately to admire Vincent's horses. Valentina stood on the porch, her stomach in knots, wearing a new dress that Vincent had surprised her with, pale green with lace at the collar. The first woman to approach her was older, perhaps 50, with kind eyes and graying hair. "Mrs. Keller, I am Margaret Walsh. My husband owns the ranch to your north. Welcome to the community." "Thank you," Valentina managed, stumbling only slightly over the words. "Please come in." More women followed, and to her surprise, they were warm and welcoming. Several complimented her dress, her home, her cooking. A few asked polite questions about Montenegro, fascinated by this exotic place they had only read about. When Valentina struggled for English words, they waited patiently, and one woman who had immigrated from Germany 20 years prior told her in a low voice, "It gets easier. Give it time. You are doing wonderfully." By evening, the barn was full of people. Someone had brought a fiddle, another a guitar, and a third produced a harmonica from his pocket. They struck up a lively tune, and couples began to dance. Vincent appeared at Valentina's elbow, extending his hand with a formal bow that made her laugh. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Keller?" "I do not know American dancing," she protested. "I will teach you," he said. "Like everything else." He led her onto the floor and pulled her into his arms, guiding her through the steps of a simple waltz. She stumbled at first, apologizing, but he just smiled and held her closer. "Feel the music," he said into her ear. "Feel how I move. You do not need words for dancing." And he was right. After a few minutes, her body found the rhythm, followed his lead naturally. They spun around the floor, and she felt beautiful and graceful and happy. This man who was her husband looking at her like she was the only woman in the world. Other men asked her to dance, the ranch neighbors and hired hands, and Vincent nodded his approval. She danced with old Mr. Walsh, who told her stories about the area's history, with young Pete, who blushed the entire time, with a dozen others whose names she tried to remember. But her eyes kept finding Vincent across the barn, dancing with the neighbor women as courtesy demanded, and each time their gazes met, a spark passed between them that had nothing to do with the music. Late in the evening, as children slept in piles on hay bales and adults began to tire, someone called for Vincent to make a speech. He tried to refuse, but the crowd insisted, and finally he climbed onto a hay bale and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate with us tonight," he began. "Most of you know I have been alone since my parents passed. This ranch has been my whole life, but it was a lonely life. When I sent for a bride, I expected. I do not know what I expected. Someone to cook and clean, perhaps. A practical arrangement. What I got was—" He paused, his eyes finding Valentina in the crowd. "What I got was a gift I did not deserve. A woman of courage who left everything she knew to come to a strange land. A woman of strength who learned a new language, a new way of life. A woman of grace who makes this house a home. Valentina, would you come here?" Confused and blushing, Valentina made her way through the crowd. Vincent helped her up onto the hay bale beside him and took both her hands in his. "I want everyone here to know that I am the luckiest man in Missouri," he said loudly. "I have a wife who is beautiful, kind, brave, and who for some reason I cannot fathom, actually seems to love me back." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "I also want to say something to my wife in her language, or as close as I can get. I have been practicing." He cleared his throat and began speaking in halting, heavily accented Montenegrin. "Valentina, you are the light of my life. You are my heart. I will love you until I die." Tears sprang to Valentina's eyes. The grammar was wrong, the pronunciation terrible, but he had learned this for her, practiced the foreign words that must have felt as strange in his mouth as English had felt in hers. She threw her arms around his neck, not caring that the entire community was watching, and kissed him soundly. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. When they finally broke apart, Vincent was grinning like a fool, and Valentina laughed through her tears. "Your Montenegrin is terrible," she told him in English. "Then you will have to keep teaching me," he replied, and kissed her again. The party broke up near midnight, families loading sleepy children into wagons and heading home across the moonlit prairie. Vincent and Valentina stood on the porch, his arm around her waist, waving goodbye to the last stragglers. When the final wagon disappeared over the hill, Vincent turned to her. "Tired?" "No," she said, which was a lie. She was exhausted. But she was also exhilarated, feeling for the first time truly part of this community, this life. "Liar," he said fondly. "Come on. The cleaning can wait until tomorrow." They walked to the barn to check on the horses one last time, a nightly ritual Vincent never skipped. The barn was a mess of overturned hay bales and scattered cups, but the horses were calm in their stalls, unconcerned by the evening's festivities. Vincent checked each one while Valentina leaned against Silver's stall, stroking the mare's nose. "Are you happy here?" Vincent asked suddenly, his back to her as he checked Midnight's water. "Truly happy? Or do you regret coming?" Valentina considered the question seriously. She thought of Montenegro, of mountains and sea and the language of her childhood. She thought of her family, scattered or dead, the village she would likely never see again. She thought of the loneliness of those first weeks, the frustration of being unable to communicate, the fear that she had made a terrible mistake. Then she thought of Vincent's patient teaching, his careful courtship of her affection, his gentleness and strength. She thought of the life they were building together, the home they shared, the respect he showed her every day. She thought of the community that had welcomed her tonight, of Margaret Walsh squeezing her hand and telling her she was brave, of dancing in her husband's arms while fiddle music played. "I am happy," she said firmly. "This is home now." Vincent turned to face her, and in the dim lantern light, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Good," he said gruffly. "That is good." Summer arrived with blazing heat and long days of work. The cattle needed to be moved to different pastures, brands checked. A few sold to a buyer who came through from Kansas City. Vincent taught Valentina to ride well enough to help with the herding, and she discovered she loved the work, the challenge of guiding stubborn cattle, the satisfaction of a job well done. In July, she realized her courses were late. At first, she thought nothing of it. Stress and change could cause such things. But when another month passed and she began to feel nauseated in the mornings, recognition dawned. She was pregnant. She waited a week before telling Vincent, wanting to be certain and also uncertain how he would react. They had never discussed children, one of many conversations their language barrier had prevented early on. Finally, one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she gathered her courage. "Vincent," she said carefully in English, "I have news." He turned to her, immediately attentive. "Good news or bad news?" "I think good news. I hope good news." She took a breath. "I am going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her and her heart sank. Then he let out a whoop of pure joy that probably echoed across the prairie, scooped her up in his arms and spun her around despite her laughing protests that he should be careful. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby. Valentina, that is wonderful. That is the best news. Are you well? Are you feeling all right? Should you be sitting down? Do you need anything?" His barrage of questions made her laugh harder. "I am fine. I am healthy. The baby will come in the spring, I think, maybe March or April." He set her down gently, as though she were made of glass, and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child," he said wonderingly, "half you, half me, a bridge between your world and mine." "Yes," she agreed, covering his hand with hers. "Our bridge." The months of her pregnancy were peaceful. Vincent became absurdly protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, which exasperated her to no end. "I am pregnant, not sick," she would tell him in increasingly fluent English. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will not break." But she secretly loved his attentiveness, how he would rub her feet when they ached, how he talked to her belly at night, telling the baby stories about the ranch, about Valentina's courage in coming to America, about all the things they would do together when the child was born. In December, Margaret Walsh came to visit, bringing her married daughter who was a midwife. The daughter, whose name was Sarah, examined Valentina and pronounced everything normal and healthy. She promised to come stay at the ranch when Valentina's time was near, to help with the delivery. "You are lucky," Margaret told Valentina over coffee and cake. "Vincent is a good man. I always worried about him after his parents died, alone out here. I am glad he found you. Glad you found each other." "I am lucky too," Valentina said and meant it. Christmas that year was magical. Vincent cut a pine tree and brought it into the house, and Valentina decorated it with paper chains and strings of popcorn, delighted by this American tradition. They exchanged small gifts. She gave him new work gloves lined with fur, and he gave her a rocking chair he had been building in secret in the barn, sized perfectly for nursing a baby. "This is beautiful," she said, running her hands over the smooth wood. "You made this." "My father taught me woodworking," he said. "I wanted you to have something special, something that would last, that maybe our grandchildren would use someday." She cried then, hormones and happiness overwhelming her, and he held her until the tears passed, murmuring reassurances and love words against her hair. Winter passed slowly, each day bringing the baby's arrival closer. Valentina nested, cleaning the house obsessively, sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric Vincent bought in town. They turned the small bedroom into a nursery, Vincent building a cradle that matched the rocking chair, Valentina embroidering blankets with the same Montenegrin patterns she had put on his Christmas shirt. March arrived with the first hints of spring, and with it came the first pains. They started in the middle of the night, waking Valentina from sleep. She lay there for a while, timing them as Sarah had taught her before shaking Vincent awake. "It is time," she said simply. He bolted upright, suddenly wide awake. "The baby, now what do I do?" Despite the pain of the next contraction, she smiled. "You ride to get Sarah, I will be fine." He did not want to leave her, but finally she pushed him toward the door. "Go, quickly, I need her here." He rode like the devil himself was chasing him, returning within the hour with Sarah and Margaret in the wagon. By then, the contractions were closer together, more intense. Sarah took one look at Valentina and nodded approvingly. "You are doing well. First babies often take a long time, but you are progressing nicely. Let us get you comfortable." What followed was hours of pain and effort, of Valentina drawing on reserves of strength she did not know she possessed. Margaret stayed by her head, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, offering sips of water. Sarah coached her through each contraction, telling her when to push and when to rest. And Vincent, despite Sarah's suggestion that he might be more comfortable waiting outside as many men did, refused to leave, holding Valentina's hand and letting her crush his fingers with each wave of pain. "You can do this," he told her over and over. "You are the strongest woman I know. You crossed an ocean. You learned a new language. You can do this." And finally, as dawn light began to paint the windows gold, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being evicted from his warm home. Sarah cleaned him quickly and placed him on Valentina's chest, and everything else faded away as Valentina looked down at the tiny person she had created. He had dark hair like hers and his father's straight nose. His eyes, when they squinted open, were dark blue, though Sarah said all babies started that way and they might change. His hands were perfect miniatures, fingers grasping at air, and when Valentina offered her finger, he grabbed it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Vincent breathed, leaning over them both. "Valentina, he is perfect. You are amazing. You are incredible." "What will you name him?" Margaret asked. Valentina and Vincent looked at each other. They had discussed names, going through English names and Montenegrin names, unable to decide. Now, looking at their son, Valentina knew. "Nicola," she said. "Nicholas, for both our traditions. Is this good?" "It is perfect," Vincent said, and kissed first her forehead, then the baby's. "Nicholas Keller, welcome to the world, son." Sarah and Margaret stayed for 3 days, teaching Valentina how to nurse the baby, how to swaddle him, how to tell what different cries meant. Vincent was utterly besotted, holding his son whenever Valentina would let him, talking to Nicola in a ridiculous high voice that made her laugh. The ranch work fell by the wayside as Vincent refused to be far from the house, wanting to be there for every moment. Pete and Charlie handled the essential tasks, grinning every time they glimpsed their boss cooing over the baby. As spring progressed into summer, they found their rhythm as parents. Nicola was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in predictable stretches. Valentina strapped him to her chest in a sling and went about her chores, talking to him in a mixture of Montenegrin and English, wanting him to know both his heritages. Vincent was a devoted father, walking the floor with Nicola when he was fussy, changing dirty cloths without complaint, singing terrible off-key lullabies that somehow worked. Watching him with their son, Valentina fell in love with him all over again, this gentle man who had given her a home and a family. When Nicola was 6 months old, healthy and thriving, Vincent proposed a trip. "Let us go to St. Joseph," he said. "Have proper photographs made." I want to remember this time." They made the journey to town, a longer trip with a baby but manageable. The photographer positioned them carefully, Vincent standing straight and serious, Valentina seated with Nicola on her lap, all of them in their best clothes. The flash powder exploded with a puff of smoke, and Nicola started crying, but the photographer assured them he had gotten the shot. While they waited for the photographs to develop, they walked through town. So much had changed since that first day when Valentina had arrived, terrified and alone. Now she walked confidently beside her husband, their son in her arms, greeting the shopkeepers in clear English, haggling cheerfully over the price of fabric at the dry goods store. They had lunch at the hotel restaurant, a rare treat, and Vincent ordered champagne to celebrate their growing family. "To us," he toasted, raising his glass, "to everything we have built together." "To love," Valentina added, clinking her glass against his, "love that needs no translation." The photographs turned out beautifully. In them, Valentina could see what they had become, a family solid and real. Vincent looked proud and protective, his hand on her shoulder. She looked happy, confident in a way she had not been 2 years ago. And Nicola, caught between squalls, looked angelic. Vincent had the photographs framed and hung them in the parlor, next to the tintype of his parents. "Our family," he said with satisfaction. "The start of our legacy." The years that followed were full and busy. Nicola grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious boy, equally fluent in English and the Montenegrin his mother taught him. He followed Vincent around the ranch, imitating his father's walk, demanding to help with chores he was far too small for. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and he was loved beyond measure. When Nicola was 3, Valentina became pregnant again. This time, she recognized the signs immediately and told Vincent right away. He was just as excited as he had been the first time, though now tempered with the experience of having done this before. Their daughter was born in the winter, a smaller, easier delivery than Nicola had been. They named her Marija, after Valentina's mother, with the middle name Rose for Vincent's mother, Sarah Rose. She had fair hair and green-brown eyes like her father, and from the moment she entered the world, she had her brother wrapped around her tiny finger. 2 years after Marija came twin boys, unexpected and chaotic. Stefan and James, named for both their grandfathers, were identical except for a small birthmark on Stefan's shoulder. They were hell-raisers from the start, climbing everything, getting into everything, keeping Valentina and Vincent constantly on their toes. Nicola, now 7, took his role as oldest seriously, trying to corral his younger siblings with limited success. Marija, 4 years old, simply bossed everyone around. The house that had once been too quiet for one man now rang with laughter and shouts, and the thunder of small feet. Vincent expanded it, adding bedrooms and a larger kitchen, converting the barn loft into quarters for the permanent ranch hands. They now needed to help manage the growing operation. Valentina had never been happier. Yes, she was exhausted. 4 children in 8 years was not easy. But she loved the chaos, the noise, the constant demands on her attention. She loved watching Vincent teach Nicola to ride, to rope, to mend fences. She loved braiding Marija's hair and teaching her to sew, passing down the skills her own mother had taught her. She loved the twins' identical grins and their capacity for mischief. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent surprised her with a trip. Margaret Walsh volunteered to watch the children for 3 days, and Vincent took Valentina to Kansas City, a place she had only heard about. They stayed in a grand hotel, ate in restaurants with white tablecloths, saw a play at the theater even though Valentina had to whisper questions to Vincent throughout, not quite understanding all the English. On their last night, lying in the fancy hotel bed, Vincent pulled her close. "Have I told you lately that you are the best thing that ever happened to me?" She smiled against his chest. "You tell me every day, sometimes with words, sometimes without." "I mean it," he insisted. "That day you stepped off the stagecoach, terrified and alone, unable to speak a word of English. I thought I was just getting a wife, someone to share the work. I never imagined I would get a partner, a best friend, the love of my life." "I was so scared," Valentina admitted. "I did not know if I could do it, learn a new language, a new life. But you were patient. You taught me that love needs no translation, that two people can understand each other through actions and intentions, even without words." "And now?" he asked. "Now I have everything," she said simply. "A husband I love, children who are healthy and happy, a home, a community. I am American now, but I am still Montenegrin too. I am both, and our children are both. It is a good life, Vincent, better than I ever dreamed." He kissed her then, tender and deep, and she tasted salt and realized he was crying. "I love you," he said when they broke apart. "God, Valentina, I love you so much." "I love you too," she replied. "For always." The children grew. Nicola became his father's shadow, learning ranching with dedication and skill. At 16, he could handle any horse on the ranch, could deliver a calf, could fix a fence line as good as any hired hand. He had his mother's intuitive kindness and his father's steady strength, and Vincent told everyone who would listen that his son would make a fine rancher someday. Marija was artistic, always drawing or painting, decorating the ranch house with her creations. She spoke both English and Montenegrin fluently, translating effortlessly between the two, and she loved to write stories about brave girls having adventures. Valentina encouraged this, remembering her own childhood dreams. The twins, Stefan and James, were inseparable and incorrigible. They were 12 now and constantly in trouble, whether it was putting a frog in the teacher's desk at school or accidentally letting all the chickens out of the coop. But they were also loyal and loving, and anyone who threatened their family quickly found themselves facing two fierce boys who fought as one. Valentina was 40 now, her dark hair showing threads of silver, her face lined with laugh wrinkles. Vincent was 46, his hair more gray than brown, his body still strong but bearing the accumulated aches of hard work. They moved a little slower than they once had, but their love had only deepened with time. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a familiar scene from over 18 years of marriage, Valentina reached over and took Vincent's hand. "Do you remember," she said, "when I first arrived and we could not talk to each other?" "I remember being terrified," Vincent admitted. "Thinking I had made a terrible mistake, bringing a woman across the world to marry a man she had never met, without even a shared language. I wondered how we would ever really know each other. And now I think I know you better than I know myself," he said. "Every expression, every gesture, I can tell what you are thinking before you speak. That first year when we had to communicate without words, we learned to pay attention in ways that words sometimes let us skip. We built something solid, something real." "Love needs no translation," Valentina said softly, repeating the words that had become their private motto. "No," Vincent agreed. "It does not, but I am glad we learned each other's languages anyway. I love hearing you tell stories to the children in Montenegrin, even though I only understand half of it. I love that they will grow up knowing both traditions, both cultures. You brought so much more than yourself when you came. You brought your history, your heritage, and you have woven it into our family. And you gave me a home," she said. "Not just a house, but a place to belong, a family, a purpose. I was so lost when I came here, Vincent. My parents dead, my brothers scattered, nothing left for me in Montenegro. I came to America because there was nothing left to stay for, but you gave me everything to live for." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue. Inside, they could hear the children arguing good-naturedly over a game, Marriage's voice rising above the chaos to enforce some rule the twins were protesting. Nicola's deeper voice, nearly a man's voice now, mediated the dispute. "We did good," Vincent said finally. "With them, with all of this. We made a good life." "Yes," Valentina agreed. "We did." As the years continued to pass, the ranch thrived under Vincent and Nicola's joint management. At 20, Nicola was as capable as any man, and Vincent increasingly trusted him with major decisions. The operation expanded, buying adjacent land when old Mr. Walsh passed, and his widow sold their ranch. Marriage surprised everyone by going to teachers' college in Kansas City, one of the first in the family to pursue higher education. She wrote long letters home, full of stories about her classes and the city, and Valentina read them aloud to the family at dinner, her heart both proud and aching. The twins, now 18, helped run the ranch but had not yet found their true callings. Stefan talked about going west to Colorado or even California, while James seemed content to stay and work the land. Valentina watched them grow and change, knowing she would have to let them fly soon, trusting she had given them wings strong enough. When Valentina was 45 and Vincent 51, their last child arrived, a complete surprise. They had thought they were long past such possibilities, their youngest 12 and Valentina's courses becoming irregular. But nature had other plans. Another daughter, born in the early summer, tiny and perfect. They named her Sophia Grace, and the entire family doted on her. Nicola was 23 now, courting a neighboring rancher's daughter, but he still made time to hold his baby sister. Marija came home from college and cried when she first saw her, overcome with the unexpected blessing. The twins, now young men of 18, were absurdly gentle with the infant, their roughhousing halted by her presence. "Our miracle baby," Vincent called her, and Valentina agreed. This child, born when they thought their family complete, felt like a benediction, a final gift. As Nicola's courtship progressed, Valentina watched him with his sweetheart Emma and saw echoes of her own story. They communicated perfectly, finishing each other's sentences, moving in harmony. Emma was a good girl, raised on a ranch, practical and kind. She reminded Valentina of herself at that age, though Emma had the advantage of speaking the same language as her beloved from the start. The wedding was held at the ranch, a grand affair with half the county in attendance. Valentina cried through the entire ceremony, watching her firstborn son promise his life to another. Vincent squeezed her hand, his own eyes damp. "Our boy is a man now," he whispered. "Yes," she said. "We raised him well." Nicola and Emma built a house on the far side of the ranch property, close enough to help with the work but far enough for privacy. Within a year, they announced Emma was expecting, and Valentina found herself about to become a grandmother at 48. The baby, a boy they named Vincent after his grandfather, arrived healthy and strong. Holding her grandson for the first time, Valentina marveled at the chain of life, the continuity. This child had her blood, her heritage, combined with Emma's family and the Keller line. He was American through and through, but also carried within him the mountains of Montenegro, the history of people his great-grandmother had known. "What do you think?" Vincent asked, watching her cradle the baby. "Being a grandmother, I think it is perfect," she said. "I get all the joy of a baby without all the sleepless nights," he laughed. "Fair point. though I seem to recall us having plenty of sleepless nights with Sophia just a few years ago. Do not remind me, she groaned. I am too old for this now. But she was not too old to help Emma, to share the wisdom of her own experiences, to bridge the generational gap with love and support. She taught Emma the Montenegrin lullabies she had sung to all her children, showed her the traditional embroidery patterns that had been passed down through her family. Emma absorbed it all, this connection to a culture not her own but now part of her son's heritage. Marriager returned home after finishing college, taking a position teaching at the school in St. Joseph. She boarded in town during the week but came home on weekends, still unmarried and content with her independence. There is time, she told her worried mother. I am only 22. I want to teach, to see something of the world. If love comes, it comes. If not, I will have a good life anyway. Valentina understood, even as she hoped her daughter would find the kind of love she herself had found. But she also admired marriage's independence, her certainty in herself. The world was changing, and women had more opportunities than they once had. If Marriage wanted to forge her own path, Valentina would support her. The twins both ended up staying on the ranch, their earlier wanderlust fading as they matured. Stefan married a girl from town, the shopkeeper's daughter, and James courted a widow with 2 small children, becoming an instant father when they wed. The ranch continued to grow, now supporting 3 family units plus the main house where Vincent and Valentina lived with young Sophia. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Vincent gave Valentina a gift that left her speechless: 2 tickets for passage to Montenegro. I want to see where you came from, he said. I want to meet your brothers, see your parents' graves, understand that part of you. We have never been able to afford it before, but the ranch is doing well, and Nicola can manage while we are gone. Say yes, Valentina. Let us go together. She had not seen her homeland in a quarter century. Her brothers, scattered across Europe, she had kept in touch with through letters, but it had been years since the last correspondence. The idea of returning, of seeing the mountains and the sea, of visiting her parents' graves and showing Vincent the church where she was baptized, overwhelmed her. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Vincent, yes. The journey was long and arduous, even more difficult than Valentina remembered from her youth. The steamship across the Atlantic took 2 weeks, and Valentina was seasick for much of it. But Vincent never left her side, holding her hair back when she retched, bringing her weak tea and dry crackers, telling her stories to distract her from her misery. When they finally landed in Europe and made their way south to Montenegro, Valentina felt like she was stepping back in time. The mountains rose around them, impossibly tall and green, so different from the rolling prairies of Missouri. The air smelled of pine and sea salt, achingly familiar. Her childhood village was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown used to the expansiveness of America. Many faces were unfamiliar, a generation having passed, but some remembered her, the young girl who had left for the new world. An old woman peered at her, then exclaimed in recognition, pulling Valentina into an embrace and chattering in rapid Montenegrin. Vincent watched, understanding nothing but smiling at his wife's joy. She translated in snatches, introducing him to people who examined him curiously, this American rancher who had married their lost daughter. They welcomed him with traditional hospitality, plying him with food and drink, teaching him a few Montenegrin phrases that he mangled charmingly. They visited her parents' graves, overgrown with wildflowers, and Valentina wept. Vincent held her, this tangible connection to the grief she had carried across an ocean. They cleaned the graves, pulled weeds, and left flowers. Valentina said prayers in Montenegrin while Vincent stood with his head bowed respectfully. I wish they could have met you, she told him. Wish they could have known their grandchildren. Tell me about them, he said. Everything you remember. So she did, sitting on the hillside overlooking the sea, telling stories of her father's carpentry and her mother's cooking, of her childhood and the life she had left behind. Vincent listened to every word, asking questions, wanting to know all of it. They found one of her brothers, Stefan, still living in a nearby town. He was older, grayer, but his smile was the same when he saw her. The siblings embraced and wept, 25 years of separation dissolving in an instant. Stefan's wife and children welcomed them, and they spent a week visiting, Stefan and Valentina talking for hours, filling in the gaps of their letters, sharing their lives. Stefan liked Vincent immediately, approving of his sister's choice even if it had taken her so far away. He looks at you the way a man should look at his wife, Stefan told her in Montenegrin. Like you are his whole world. I am glad, sister, glad you found happiness even in a strange land. When it was time to leave, Valentina cried again, knowing it was likely she would never return, never see her brother or her homeland again. But this time, the grief was tempered with closure. She had shown Vincent where she came from, had reconnected with her roots, had said proper goodbyes to her parents and her past. On the ship back to America, she stood at the rail with Vincent's arm around her, watching the European coastline fade into the distance. "No regrets?" he asked. "No regrets," she confirmed. "I needed to see it again to remember, but my home is with you now, wherever you are. America is where I belong." They returned to Missouri to find everything running smoothly under Nicola's capable management. Sophia, now 13, had grown 3 inches in their absence and complained bitterly that they had been gone too long. The grandchildren, including 2 more who had arrived while they were gone, clamored for attention and stories about the trip. Valentina settled back into her life with contentment. She had faced her past, honored it, and chosen her future. The dual nature of her identity, Montenegrin and American, felt finally resolved within her. The years continued their relentless march. Vincent's hair went completely white, and he moved with the careful deliberation of aging joints. Valentina's back ached from decades of hard work, and her eyes were not what they once were. But they had built something lasting, something beautiful. Their children all married and settled nearby, unable to stray far from the family orbit. The ranch supported them all, divided into parcels but managed cooperatively. Grandchildren numbered in the double digits, and Valentina lost track of whose child was whose sometimes. But she loved them all fiercely. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw them a party that rivaled their original barn dance. Children and grandchildren filled the house and yard, along with neighbors and friends accumulated over 4 decades. People gave speeches about Vincent and Valentina's enduring love, their successful partnership, the legacy they had built. When it was their turn to speak, Vincent stood with difficulty, his once strong body finally showing its age. He was 71 now, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his voice was still strong. 40 years ago, I sent for a bride I had never met, from a country I could not find on a map, who spoke not one word of English. Everyone thought I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. But I was alone and lonely and desperate for partnership. What I got was beyond anything I could have imagined. Valentina, my love, my heart, you have made my life complete. Every day with you has been a gift. Our children, our grandchildren, this life we built together, it is all because you had the courage to step off that stagecoach and trust a stranger. Thank you for 40 years. Thank you for everything. Valentina stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. When I came here, she said, her English now perfect though still accented. "I could not speak to you with words, but you taught me that love needs no translation. You showed me through your actions, your patience, your kindness. You taught me English, taught me to be a rancher's wife, taught me to be an American. But you never asked me to stop being Montenegrin. You let me keep my language, my traditions, my heritage, and you wove them into our family. Our children know both worlds, belong to both cultures. That is your gift to me, Vincent. You let me be fully myself while building a new life. I love you. I have loved you for 40 years, and I will love you until I die." They kissed while their family cheered, and if they clung to each other a little desperately, aware of time's passage and their own mortality, no one mentioned it. Vincent died 2 years later, in the spring, peacefully in his sleep beside the woman he loved. Valentina woke to find him cold beside her, and her wail of grief echoed across the ranch that had been their shared dream. She was 64, and suddenly alone for the first time since she was 22. The family rallied around her, but nothing could fill the Vincent-shaped hole in her life. For 42 years he had been her partner, her best friend, her love. Half her lifetime had been spent with him, and now he was gone. Nicola wanted her to move in with him and Emma, but Valentina refused. "This house is full of memories," she said. "This is where we raised our children, where we built our life. I am not leaving." So she stayed, surrounded by ghosts of the past, but also by the living presence of her family. Her children visited daily, her grandchildren ran wild through the house as their parents had before them. She taught them Montenegrin songs and American recipes, told them stories about their grandfather, about the old country, about the early days when she and Vincent could barely communicate, but loved each other anyway. She lived to be 83, sharp-minded until the end, though her body finally gave out. On her last day, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, she smiled peacefully. "I am ready," she told Nicola, who held her hand. "I will see your father again soon." "Tell him we miss him," Nicola said through tears. "Tell him the ranch is doing well, that his legacy lives on." "He knows," Valentina said. "He has always known. We built something good, your father and I, something lasting. Take care of it, all of you. Remember where you came from, both sides of your heritage. And remember that love needs no translation. That is the most important thing I can teach you." She died as the sun set, slipping away peacefully, and they buried her beside Vincent on the hill overlooking the ranch. Two graves side by side, like his parents before them, marking the resting place of two people who had loved deeply and built beautifully. At the funeral, Marriager read a poem she had written, about a young woman stepping off a stagecoach into the unknown, about a rancher who looked at her and saw not a foreigner but a future, about two people learning to communicate across language barriers, building a bridge of love and patience and determination. The ranch continued, generation after generation, the Keller name enduring. They kept the traditions Valentina had brought from Montenegro, the embroidery patterns and songs and recipes, woven seamlessly into their American lives. Every child learned at least some Montenegrin, even as English was their primary language, honoring the grandmother who had come so far and given them so much. And in the old house where Vincent and Valentina had lived and loved and raised their family, a framed photograph hung on the wall. A young man standing proud, a young woman seated with a baby in her lap, all of them looking toward a future they could not yet see but would build together, word by word, day by day, in a love that needed no translation to understand.